Well, thank you. I'm pretty much in the line of what was presented this morning on structural transformation and what my predecessors have mentioned on inclusive growth. What we're going to do here is present an example where we've actually tried to use all our complexity tools with the support of the Mexican government, the Inter-American Development Bank, to go to a place that it's possible for many people and see how we can help, and in particular, how we can make our help inclusive. What are the reasons that are causing growth or the lack of growth not to be so much inclusive? So we went to Chiapas. I mean, we've been familiar here with large differences in income across countries, and Minister Videgaray this morning made the whole group familiar with large differences in income within Mexico. But what it's really a surprise is that if you go to Chiapas, which is the poorest state in Mexico, and you click on Chiapas, the difference between the richest state in Mexico and Chiapas is a factor of 6. The difference between the richest municipality in Chiapas and the poorest municipality in Chiapas is a factor of 8.5. So this goes to reinforce the point of Ricardo earlier, and Marcela as well, that there's something about growth that is by nature unequal. There's something about growth that is not equal by spontaneously or by nature. And that's why we need to do something about growth. And so we're going to explore the experience at a subnational level. And in the end, we'll try to come up with some ideas on why do we think that it's happening. Chiapas is not only the poorest place in Mexico, but it's the place that have been growing at the slowest rate over the previous decade. So all the conclusions of the neoclassical economists, Chiapas is the poorest place, so it will grow faster and will eventually catch up, is not occurring. What it's occurring, in fact, is that if you present the income of Chiapas as a percentage of the income of Mexico, the gap between Chiapas and the rest of Mexico over the previous 10 years, and you can go back and you'll find the same over the previous 20 years, has been widening. Well, you might think this is a poor place, so we pick the other two very poor states of Mexico, which is Guerrero and Oaxaca. And Guerrero and Oaxaca sort of barely managed to hold on to the Mexican growth average of income per capita over the previous decade was 1.4. So that's why, as a percentage of national income, Guerrero and Oaxaca hold on. Somehow Chiapas only grew 0.2%, and that's why the gap is widening. And this is a puzzle because since the Zapatista uprising in January 1994, Chiapas has been the focus of a lot of policy attention. There's been a lot of attention on Chiapas. A lot of resources have been poured into Chiapas, into education, into infrastructure. And after all that policy effort and all that attention, what we get is that the gap has widened. So that's why it's so interesting for us to go there. That's why we pulled resources together and got a team there of more than 20 people between Harvard scholars and some friends from the World Bank and EIDB, and think, what is going on there in Chiapas? So you might think that the state wanted to do an effort on education. The traditional way to look at these differences is from an individual perspective. So what are the assets of individual in Chiapas? They're lacking in assets, and that's why they don't make it. So we go to education. If you look at education, what you have on that chart on top is years of schooling. So you can see that the years of schooling of Chiapas have been growing faster than the years of schooling of Mexico. And as a consequence, the chart you have down shows the gap. The gap has been brought down from 3.2 years to 1.9 years. So there's been a large improvement in education. Moreover, if you look at returns to education, how much you make per how much years of education you've got. So we have the dotted lines there are primary school, mid-secondary school, high school, university, and master. At all levels, the people in Chiapas with the same education of other people in Mexico make a lot less. Or if you want to see it in another way, if you want to make in Chiapas the same salary as someone else makes in Mexico, studying 6 years, you need to study 10 years. So it's clearly not a point of education. When we first presented this to our counterparts in Mexico, they said, well, there might be an issue with the quality of education. So thank God Mexico has a lot of instruments. They have this standardized test. So we try to correct this, and we created this econometrically blue line, which is let's give the people in Chiapas the quality of education of the rest of Mexico. And what you see there is that some of the gap narrows, in particular if you finish a master's degree, 18 years of education, but for all the people, the gap still remains. So it's clearly, there was a large investment in education. Education improved a lot, but it's clearly not the binding constraint. And what we learn more is if you have a worker in Mexico and a worker in Chiapas, and the Mexican worker decides to migrate elsewhere within Mexico, he will make a prime of 15% on his salary. The Chiapas one, when he migrates from Chiapas to elsewhere in Mexico, makes this prime. So in the end, a guy with 6th grade in Chiapas that migrates outside Chiapas to work makes more money than a guy with the same education on the place he's going, and even correcting for migrants. So this is clearly telling us that education, sure, it's part of the equation, and it has a lot of positive spillovers that are desirable. But in Chiapas, that was not part of the problem. In fact, if you take all the individual factors, schooling, experience, are you female or not, indigenous, do you live in a rural community, all the individual factors just explain a third of the differences in income between Chiapas and the rest. So what do you think that can be happening there? Our conclusion is there's nothing wrong with the people in Chiapas. There must be something about the place. So we turn to look at the place where our complexity statistics or theory of Scrabble that Ricardo mentioned yesterday. Thanks to the contribution of my son, we have the theory of Scrabble in Chiapas. And what we see, if you see the exports of Chiapas, is one of the least complex places. So there's a lot of skills and knowledge that never made it to Chiapas. So the country makes very simple things that everybody else knows how to make and therefore have very low value added. But because it has so little skills, every additional skills that you add gets more difficult or less value in putting up more complex words because they lack too much words. Now you can say these are exports. We look at this also from a census standpoint, including all that means services. And Chiapas still is one of the least complex places in Mexico. Actually, if you calculate complexity by municipality, which we can do in Chiapas, you will get a picture of a large variety of places that is somehow consistent with the large variety of incomes that we have seen before within Chiapas. And here you can see in the center, very red, it's Tuxtla Gutierrez, is the capital, is the most complex place, and then to the south, near the border with Guatemala, Tapachula. These are the most complex places in Chiapas, and they coexist with other places of low complexity. And if you put a map of poverty on top of the complexity map, you'll find out that the poorest places are actually places that lack tools, that are the least complex. So when you add complexity to the equation, complexity is the factor that explains most of the difference between Chiapas and the rest of Mexico, and you increase the percentage you understand up to more than 50% when we, without complexity, had 30%. So complexity is clearly part of the equation. Now people say, yeah, but complexity, it's endogenous in education. Well, we think it's the other way around, because you don't want to study to acquire skills in an economy that has no way to demand and remunerate those skills. So actually, low complexity disincentivizes it takes away incentives to acquire more education. So in any case, it's a bi-directional relationship. So this is what Mexico does. This is what Chiapas does. Chiapas basically does mineral and vegetables. So if you look at Mexico in the product space, Luis Videgaray did it this morning. You see this wide variety of complex places. Then you look at Chiapas. And Chiapas, there's nowhere. There's nothing in Chiapas. And yet, you might look at that chart and say, hey, there's a purple point there in the center. Somehow, a complex industry made it to Chiapas. So what's going on there? So we went there. It's only one, so it wasn't hard to identify. So it turns out to be Yasaki. It's a company that manufactures harnesses for cars and export them to 4 automobile companies, 2 of them in the north of Mexico, 2 of them in Japan. And this is the way it looks. It looks modern, it looks production line, it looks knowledge. Well, Yasaki made it to Chiapas in a large effort by President Cedillo in 1994 of bringing modern production to Chiapas. So what he did is something we've been talking about here earlier, is he wanted to bring modern production there. He talked to them, and he told them, what are you missing? Why you're not there in Chiapas? So the state made a big effort to provide the public goods that were missing for this company, that it's labor intensive in any case. That's what it's abundant in Chiapas to come. And then he made it possible. So Yasaki started with one plant, 1,500 employees, and today has 5 plants, 3,000 employees, and has two more plants in the making. So it's funny the way Yasaki has expanded throughout Chiapas. They don't grow on the same location. They just move around. So what they're doing, because their production processes allows for that, is that they break the process, and they take pieces of the process to where the workers are. Because in Chiapas, for cultural reasons, we might talk later, that actually make very hard for growth to be inclusive, people do not move often. They don't migrate. I'm coming to the end. So the pattern Yasaki has used to expand, it's very telling of the nature of the constraints in Chiapas. Workers are finding trouble getting to the job places. And if you look at transportation, we did some work in a community called Cruston in San Juan Chamula. It's a community 10 minutes away from San Cristobal de las Casas, which is Chiapas' second largest city. So these are the salaries all these professions make in the city. So you have their washer, you have also electrician, you have director of school, and this is what the transport for them cost to go from the town to the center, which is 10 minutes away. So when you look at that, you see that the lower end of the professions paid a huge tax of their salary, and as a consequence, for the lower end, it makes no sense to go and work in the city. There's no public transportation, there's no commuting between places 10 minutes away from the center, and therefore they have to share a private taxi. When you take a percentage of the salary a private taxi is, it's a huge tax. This is one of the things that in Chiapas, we found some similar pattern now in Panama. It's keeping people away from the growth process. Like Ricardo would say, they have skills, but they cannot bring their skills to the market because it's too expensive for them. So they remain in a place with very low demand, very low economic activity, where they devote themselves to very low productivity things, which in turn determine that they are poor and disconnected. So what we did, and this is more like the end because we've been talking about, we look at the largest urban centers of Chiapas, and then we try to come up with list of things that there will have lots of potential of showing up. And when you look at Chiapas, you see this hefty, positive sloping line. That means there are no low-hanging fruits in Chiapas. Like Piero Gacy said this morning, well, there are not many low-hanging fruits. In Chiapas, if you want to get high complexity, you're going to try to make a huge jump, and that involves a lot of risk. If you look at places that have more letters, like Morelos, for instance, Morelos have plenty of spots, industries they don't have, high complexity, and very short distance. They have too many letters, so it's easy for them to acquire new letters and with them form longer words. For Chiapas, it's going to be more hard. Chiapas, as you see here, is the state not only with the lowest complexity, but the state with the lowest probability of acquiring letters. So we identify industries for all these 4 places, and then we are proposing, let's make an effort, the government, regional and national, and the private sector, and let's try to bring new business models to Chiapas. So we try to engine this through an investment promotion agency. Mexico has a very successful pro-Mexico agency. Well, you need a pro-Chiapas agency to bring investment to Chiapas. Your most likely candidates are not in Japan, are not in the US, are guys that put a plant in Nuevo León. And because of the Nuevo León's own success, the level of salaries went up, and they are now uncompetitive. When Luis Videgaray showed this morning the evolution of the product space, he showed that the whole textile and garment industry have disappeared. Well, that's a consequence of Mexico competing in the US markets with Chinese textiles and garments. So, well, those guys could go to Chiapas. They have already taken the decision to take the Mexican risk. So you don't have to sell them Mexico, you have to sell them Chiapas. We are also recommending special economic zones, very hard to make it happen. Our experience is a zone is efficient, it solves the problem of the particular place. In Chiapas, the particular place that has the problem is moving workers to the places, so we are recommending putting up a special economic zone in San Cristobal de las Casas and creating a commuting system that covers 30 kilometers around the city, which basically will include in the economy of the town 600,000 people. Now, if you connect these people and you don't do anything, salaries in the city will go down and salaries of the people in the vicinity will go up. But if you manage to make an effort to engine some growth within Chiapas and solve the constraints of the private sector, whatever they are, for these sectors we identified as potential, then you may have very fast a shortage of labor, which is what is happening in Tuxtla Gutiérrez. And then your commuting system can incorporate people into growth and solve this constraint. And we are also recommending public transportation, I just mentioned that. And also we are proposing that we tie that with housing policy. Mexico has made a lot of effort in housing and has too many ghost towns. These are towns that are in cheap lands. They are cheap because they're not connected. No one wants to live there because they have no way to get into their job. So we are proposing, the people don't want a house, they want a habitat. They want a place where they live, and from them they get a bus, they find a job, they have a productive job, they get back. So this is what we're proposing. It's not going to be easy. We don't have the solution. We just came up with this after a year of work in Chiapas and 171 man days in Chiapas, 42 from me in particular, but Ricardo also put a lot of work there. And we want to try this and see how this works out. It's not going to be easy, but this is the way how complexity colors the policy on development.